Today we are witnessing not just the fall of another European cabinet, but the unraveling of a story that reaches far beyond Paris. The French government has collapsed again, and this is not an isolated tremor. It is the third time in less than a year that a prime minister has fallen, toppled not by foreign adversaries or external shocks, but by the grinding weight of domestic paralysis. Now you might ask, is this just French politics as usual, the theater of constant reshuffles? Or is this the moment when Europe's second-largest economy reveals cracks that can no longer be hidden? Picture the scene. In the halls of the National Assembly, François Bayrou, the prime minister who promised to restore order, is forced to confront a vote of no confidence. The numbers are brutal: 364 against 194 in his favor, and in that instant, his government is finished. What follows is not relief, not stability, but the appointment of yet another prime minister, Sébastien Lecornu, the fourth in less than 2 years. This is not the smooth choreography of democracy. This is a house of cards collapsing under the strain of debt, protest, and a loss of political faith. When a government falls once, it is a political event. When it falls twice, it is a crisis. But when it falls 3 times in less than a year, it becomes something more dangerous, a systemic failure. And systemic failures never remain confined. France is not a peripheral state. It is the heart of the European Union, a founding pillar of the euro, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. If France cannot govern itself, then the entire architecture of European stability is placed under question. This is not about personalities alone. Bayrou may be out, Lecornu may be in, Macron may still hold the presidency, but the deeper story is about legitimacy. The people of France are rejecting austerity plans designed to cut €44 billion in spending. They are rejecting the narrative that more sacrifices will eventually lead to recovery. And they are rejecting the very premise that their leaders have the credibility to guide them through crisis. Once that perception takes root, once the public ceases to believe, no new prime minister can reverse it overnight. The hook is clear. We are not just watching another French cabinet reshuffle. We are watching the erosion of trust in one of Europe's central powers. A moment that turns domestic turbulence into a shockwave with global consequences. Let us lay out the facts as they unfolded, because clarity here is crucial. On the 8th of September, 2025, the French National Assembly delivered a decisive and humiliating blow to Prime Minister François Bayrou. The numbers tell the story: 364 deputies voted against him, while only 194 stood in support. It was not just defeat, it was obliteration. In that single moment, Bayrou's government collapsed, and with it, the fragile illusion that France had regained its political footing. Picture the chamber, the air heavy with tension, deputies on both the left and the right uniting not out of shared ideology, but out of shared disdain for a budget plan that promised €44 billion in cuts. Imagine the pounding of fists on wooden desks, the jeers, the silence when the tally was read. Bayrou had gambled on austerity as the cure for France's mounting debt crisis. Instead, austerity became his undoing. The aftermath was swift. Within hours, President Emmanuel Macron had to act. His choice was Sébastien Lecornu, the 39-year-old former defense minister, plucked from the inner circle and thrust into the prime minister's chair. He became Macron's 4th prime minister in 2 years, a revolving door of leaders that underscored instability rather than strength. Macron's move was meant to project continuity, but to many it looked like desperation. The message was clear: France is governing by reflex, not by vision. Beyond the parliament, the streets told a different story. Protesters mobilized under the banner, "Block everything." This was not rhetoric, it was a strategy. They aimed to paralyze the nation with strikes, roadblocks, and mass demonstrations. Over 80,000 police were deployed to maintain order, a figure that revealed both the scale of public anger and the government's fear of losing control. Picture the tear gas rising in the boulevards of Paris. Picture rail stations frozen. Picture a nation brought to a standstill, not by foreign invasion, but by its own citizens. The economic backdrop only made the collapse more dramatic. France's debt had climbed to 114% of GDP. Investors began to treat French bonds as though they belonged to the risky periphery, not the core of Europe. Analysts warned that by 2029, debt servicing could cost €100 billion annually. The narrative of France as a stable economic anchor was starting to look like fiction. And in politics, perception drives reality. Once the markets smell weakness, they magnify it. This is where the paradox lies. France is one of the architects of European integration, a nuclear-armed state, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Yet domestically, its government was brought down by a single vote, by a parliament that could not unite on a fiscal path forward. The disconnect between France's global stature and its domestic fragility was stark, and it shocked observers both inside and outside Europe. Now, consider the optics internationally. To Brussels, the collapse raised alarms about whether France could push forward with EU budget negotiations. To Berlin, it was a warning sign that Germany might be left carrying Europe's economic load alone. To Washington, it was a reminder that one of NATO's key players was preoccupied with internal dysfunction. And to Moscow and Beijing, it was confirmation that Western democracies were not just fragile abroad, but brittle at home. The hook here is undeniable. The fall of Bayrou was not just a domestic episode of parliamentary arithmetic, but a spectacle that revealed the deep cracks in the French political system and amplified the sense that Europe's second-largest economy is stumbling at the very moment the world expects stability. When we step inside the French crisis and look at the domestic battlefield, the magnitude of this collapse becomes even clearer. It is not just the downfall of one leader or one cabinet. It is a rupture that touches every layer of French society: workers, businesses, families, and institutions. Today we are witnessing the unraveling of France's internal fabric, and the hook is clear: domestic cracks never stay domestic for long. Let us start with the heart of the matter: austerity. Bayrou's proposed plan called for €44 billion in spending cuts. That number is not abstract. It translates into fewer benefits, fewer protections, fewer holidays, and higher taxes. For ordinary French citizens already facing stagnant wages and rising living costs, this was not a fiscal strategy. It was a declaration of war on their livelihoods. Imagine a middle-class family in Lyon being told that school subsidies will be reduced, that health coverage will shrink, that tax burdens will grow. To them, the Prime Minister's message was not stability, but sacrifice without promise of relief. The labor market reflected this frustration. France had been grappling with unemployment hovering around 7%, and while lower than historic highs, the quality of jobs was declining. Precarious contracts, gig economy work, and wage stagnation left many feeling trapped. Bayrou's austerity measures threatened to deepen this insecurity. For young graduates already skeptical about their future, the collapse of the government was less a shock than a confirmation that the political class was detached from their reality. Businesses, too, were caught in the storm. Large corporations may weather higher taxes and regulatory uncertainty, but small and medium enterprises, the backbone of the French economy, were left exposed. Rising borrowing costs, uncertainty in public investment, and the specter of strikes meant stalled projects and frozen hiring. Entrepreneurs in Marseille or Lille began to ask themselves whether it was even possible to plan for growth when the government itself could not last a year. Domestic instability had become the greatest enemy of economic planning. Housing and real estate added another layer of strain. France's housing market had long been inflated, with Paris among the most expensive cities in Europe. Rising interest rates, combined with falling consumer confidence, pushed younger generations further from home ownership. For them, the government's talk of budgetary discipline rang hollow. Stability was promised for tomorrow, but insecurity was guaranteed for today. This widening gap between policy rhetoric and lived reality eroded the last reservoirs of trust. History offers sobering parallels. Think of the United States in 2008, when the collapse of Lehman Brothers was not just a financial crisis but a household crisis, families losing homes, workers losing jobs. Or India in 1991, when balance of payments failure forced the nation into reforms that redefined its trajectory. In both cases, domestic shocks reshaped global realities. France is now on a similar precipice. Its debt ratio at 114% of GDP is not just a statistic, it is a signal that one of Europe's anchors is drifting dangerously close to Italy-like fragility. The protests magnify this domestic fragility. Block everything is more than a slogan, it is a manifestation of rage. Strikes in transport cripple rail and metro systems, farmers block highways with tractors, students occupy campuses. When 80,000 police officers are deployed on French streets, the government is not projecting control, it is admitting fear of losing it. The paradox is striking. A state that aspires to lead Europe internationally is struggling to govern its own boulevards. Strategically, this collapse also undermines Macron's long-standing ambition to project France as a global leader. He has spoken of European sovereignty, of France as the guardian of Western stability. Yet, at home, he cannot secure parliamentary support for a fiscal plan. This disconnect erodes credibility. How can Macron convince allies abroad when he cannot convince deputies at home? The hook here is unavoidable. Legitimacy abroad begins with legitimacy at home, and right now France has neither. Debt dynamics make the crisis more urgent. By 2029, France may spend €100 billion annually just on interest payments. That figure dwarfs budgets for defense or education. For ordinary citizens, it means less money for services they rely on daily. For policymakers, it means less room to maneuver. And for investors, it raises the specter of France becoming the next domino in a Eurozone debt crisis. Each number, each projection, is a reminder that the domestic and the strategic are now inseparable. Consider perception in the markets. When traders begin pricing French bonds closer to Italian yields, they are not making a technical adjustment. They are signaling a loss of faith in France's fiscal reliability. That perception bleeds into politics, into households, into the very perception of national strength. The hook here is clear. Once markets begin to doubt, that doubt becomes self-fulfilling. Finally, we must not overlook the psychological toll. For many French citizens, this collapse feels like déjà vu. They have seen governments rise and fall, promises made and broken, austerity imposed and reversed. Cynicism becomes the default. And cynicism is corrosive. A society that stops believing in its leaders does not merely face political turbulence, it faces existential doubt about its future. The hook is undeniable. France's domestic crisis is not a passing episode. It is a convergence of economic strain, political paralysis, and social anger. And once that convergence takes hold, it becomes a force that reshapes not just France's trajectory, but Europe's as well. Domestic cracks never stay domestic for long. Perception drives reality. That is the recurring motif we must return to, because in politics and economics alike, what people believe often matters more than what the balance sheets say. Today, France is living through a crisis of perception as much as a crisis of governance. The fall of François Bayrou's government and the rapid appointment of Sébastien Lecornu did not restore confidence. It deepened the sense that France is stuck in an endless cycle of instability. Let us begin with the perception of ordinary citizens. For the French people, politics has become a carousel of broken promises. They are told that austerity is necessary to restore stability, but they see their wages stagnate, their taxes climb, and their public services shrink. They are told that France is a pillar of Europe, but they witness their parliament descend into chaos and their leaders change every few months. Imagine a young student in Paris who has grown up under governments that fail before finishing their term. For her, politics no longer looks like a path to solutions, it looks like a revolving door. The hook here is undeniable. Perception drives reality. And when the public perceives endless dysfunction, that dysfunction becomes reality. Investors carry their own perception, and it is no less consequential. In the world of finance, confidence is currency. France's debt levels are not uniquely catastrophic. Other countries have carried similar burdens, but the perception that France is sliding into Italy-like fragility shifts how markets behave. Bond yields rise not simply because the numbers demand it, but because traders perceive that France is no longer safe. Once that label sticks, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Investors demand higher returns, debt servicing costs balloon, and the narrative of instability cements itself. The hook here is undeniable. Perception drives reality in markets faster than in politics. Allies, too, perceive the collapse through their own lens. For Brussels, the fall of another French government is not just an internal matter, it is a warning that the EU's second-largest economy is politically paralyzed. For Berlin, it signals that Germany may be left shouldering the burden of European stability alone. For Washington, it raises doubts about whether France can contribute reliably to NATO commitments. For Moscow and Beijing, it reinforces the perception that Western democracies are brittle and that Europe's core is hollowing out from within. Here again, perception drives reality. Allies hesitate, adversaries advance. We must also consider the perception of legitimacy. Emmanuel Macron may still sit in the Élysée Palace, but legitimacy is not about occupying an office. It is about whether people, both domestic and foreign, believe that leadership carries weight. Macron has appointed his fourth prime minister in 2 years. That fact alone feeds the perception that France is ungovernable. And once the perception of ungovernability takes hold, even decisive policies lose their impact. A leader can announce reforms, but if the audience believes collapse is inevitable, reforms fall flat. The hook here is undeniable. Perception drives reality, and legitimacy once eroded is almost impossible to rebuild quickly. The business community shares this skepticism. French entrepreneurs do not only look at tax rates or labor laws, they look at the overall climate. When they perceive the government as unstable, they hold back investment, delay hiring, and freeze expansion plans. That in turn reinforces economic stagnation, which further undermines public faith. Picture a small business owner in Marseille who wonders if it is wise to expand when strikes could paralyze his supply chains next month. His hesitation is not rooted in immediate numbers, but in perception of instability. And yet, his hesitation becomes an economic fact when thousands of others make the same choice. Even cultural perception plays a role. France has long cultivated an image of itself as the city of light, the intellectual and political beacon of Europe. But images are fragile. When international media describe France as lurching from one collapse to another, the perception of a beacon dims. Tourism, investment, and soft power all depend on the perception of stability and vitality. If that perception fades, the damage extends beyond politics into the national identity itself. This is where the illusion shatters. For years, France has lived on the perception that its institutions, though noisy and fractious, ultimately functioned. That illusion is now broken. Citizens no longer trust their leaders, investors no longer trust French bonds, and allies no longer trust France as a stable partner. Each group acts on its perception, and in doing so, they transform that perception into reality. The hook here is undeniable. Perception drives reality, and France is now trapped in a feedback loop of distrust and decline. The lesson is stark. In moments of crisis, perception becomes the most valuable commodity a government can preserve. Lose it, and no austerity plan, no new appointment, no police deployment can restore stability. France has lost that commodity. And until it regains it, each collapse will not be seen as an isolated event, but as proof of a deeper unraveling. The hook is immediate and unavoidable. Perception drives reality, and in France today, reality has become the very crisis that perception predicted. Today, we are not just examining France in isolation, we are looking at the tremors that ripple outward when Europe's second-largest economy falters. A domestic collapse in Paris does not stay within France's borders. It shakes the Eurozone, it rattles global markets, and it redefines geopolitical alignments. The hook is immediate. When a nation shakes, markets tremble worldwide. First, consider the Eurozone. France is not Greece, nor is it Italy, yet investors are starting to treat it as though it belongs to that vulnerable club. The collapse of François Bayrou's government on the back of a failed austerity plan raises the question of whether France can manage its 114% debt to GDP ratio without triggering contagion. Picture the dominoes lined up. If France is seen as unreliable, then Spain and Portugal are next under scrutiny, and suddenly the entire architecture of the Eurozone looks weaker. The perception of weakness in Paris quickly becomes a test of confidence in Europe's common currency. The European Central Bank feels this pressure acutely. In Frankfurt, policymakers are balancing inflation control with the risk of sovereign debt panic. If French yields continue to climb toward Italian levels, the ECB faces a dilemma: intervene to stabilize France, or risk allowing one of Europe's anchors to drift. Intervention could mean renewed bond-buying programs, which clash with the ECB's inflation-fighting mission. Doing nothing could mean watching Europe's second-largest economy slide into fiscal crisis. Either way, the fall of a French government forces the hand of Europe's central bankers, and markets worldwide take note. Trade and supply chains are equally exposed. France is not only a consumer market of 67 million people, it is also a critical hub for European logistics, agriculture, and manufacturing. A nation in turmoil is a nation whose ports and railways can be paralyzed by strikes, whose regulations become unpredictable, and whose policies shift with each new prime minister. For exporters in Asia or energy suppliers in the Middle East, uncertainty in France means uncertainty in contracts, pricing, and stability of delivery. Picture a container ship rerouted because a French port is blockaded, or a supply chain manager in Detroit recalculating costs because French strikes halted shipments. These are not theoretical risks, they are the practical global consequences of domestic upheaval. Financial markets have already begun to respond. Analysts point to France's debt servicing trajectory, with interest payments projected to surpass €100 billion by 2029. That figure alarms not just European banks, but global investors from Tokyo to New York. If France requires bailouts or ECB intervention, the perception of the euro as a stable reserve currency weakens. That, in turn, affects central bank holdings worldwide, shifts capital flows, and forces re-evaluations of risk. When a nation like France stumbles, it does not stumble alone, it drags markets and currencies with it. The hook here is undeniable. The fall of Paris shakes the pillars of global finance. Now, look at alliances. Washington views France as a cornerstone of NATO and a reliable partner in Western strategy. Yet a France consumed by domestic chaos is a France less able to contribute meaningfully to collective defense or to diplomacy. At the very moment when the United States is recalibrating its global role, the perception that France is unstable forces Washington to look elsewhere for European leadership. That weakens transatlantic unity and emboldens rivals who sense division. For Moscow and Beijing, the collapse in Paris is confirmation of a narrative they have long promoted, that Western democracies are brittle, paralyzed by debt and division, incapable of sustaining stability. Russian state media can point to French protests as proof that liberal democracy is in decay. Chinese strategists can highlight Macron's revolving door of prime ministers as evidence that Europe lacks the consistency to be a true global pole. In perception terms, each French failure is a propaganda victory for those who seek to challenge Western order. Global South nations watch with a different eye. For years, France has tried to maintain influence in Africa, to position itself as a voice in the Middle East, and to remain relevant in Asia. But instability at home diminishes credibility abroad. If Paris cannot maintain fiscal discipline and political cohesion, why should emerging economies look to France for guidance? Already, African nations are pivoting toward new partnerships with China and Russia, and instability in France only accelerates that trend. The hook here is immediate. Domestic weakness erodes soft power faster than treaties can repair it. Energy markets also feel the tremors. France is a major player in nuclear energy and an important node in Europe's energy grid. Political paralysis creates uncertainty around energy policy, climate commitments, and investment in infrastructure. That uncertainty ripples into European energy markets, which then ripple into global pricing. When investors wonder if France can deliver on its commitments, volatility follows. We must also consider the symbolic dimension. France is not just a European nation. It is a symbol of Western civilization, of the Enlightenment, of political modernity. When the government in Paris collapses for the third time in a year, the symbolism is devastating. Allies begin to ask, if France cannot hold itself together, can Europe? Adversaries point and say, if France is crumbling, why should the rest of the world take Western unity seriously? In the battle of narratives, perception becomes as powerful as military force. The hook is undeniable. The collapse of France's government has unleashed a chain reaction that reaches far beyond French borders. It shakes the Eurozone, rattles the ECB, destabilizes trade, emboldens adversaries, and weakens allies. In a world already fragile with inflation, war, and great power rivalry, France's domestic drama has become a global drama. The hook is immediate. When a nation shakes, markets tremble worldwide. The collapse of France's government is not just a French story, nor even just a European one. It is a political earthquake with consequences that cascade through alliances, reshaping the very architecture of global power. Domestic instability becomes alliance instability, because no state, however powerful, operates in isolation. The hook is clear. Domestic politics has become global politics. Let us start with the European Union. France, alongside Germany, has been the twin engine of European integration. When one engine falters, the entire aircraft wobbles. The repeated collapse of French government sends a clear message to Brussels. Consensus is impossible when one of your largest members cannot even govern itself. Negotiations over EU budgets, climate policy, and defense commitments now stall because Paris lacks continuity. Picture the European Council convening while France changes prime ministers yet again. Picture leaders hesitating to launch ambitious projects because they doubt France can sustain its commitments. The EU's cohesion is weakened, and with it, the very perception of Europe as a unified actor. Germany faces the heaviest burden. Berlin has long sought to share leadership with Paris, presenting a Franco-German tandem as the core of European unity. But with France consumed by domestic crisis, Germany finds itself increasingly alone. The perception in Berlin is that Germany must now shoulder not only economic stability but also political credibility. That dynamic risks reviving old resentments as other EU members begin to view integration as German dominance rather than European partnership. The hook here is undeniable. As France collapses internally, the balance of power within the EU shifts in ways that could reignite old fractures. For NATO, the implications are equally severe. France has always had a complex relationship with the alliance, at times asserting autonomy, at times embracing unity. Yet today, the alliance cannot afford a distracted France. With tensions in Eastern Europe, ongoing war in Ukraine, and growing Russian assertiveness, NATO needs coherence. Instead, it sees one of its central members paralyzed by domestic strife. Washington reads this as a warning that France may be unable to deliver on its defense commitments. For smaller NATO members on the eastern flank, this fuels anxiety. If France falters, can the alliance truly hold? The hook is immediate. An unstable Paris weakens the shield of NATO. Now look at the adversaries. For Moscow, this is a gift. Russian strategists interpret French collapse as validation of their narrative, that Western democracies are hollow, distracted, and incapable of sustained leadership. Every protest in Paris becomes footage for Russian media to broadcast as proof that liberal institutions are failing. Every resignation in the French government is framed as evidence that Europe is in decline. Perception here is weaponized. Russia does not need to defeat NATO militarily if NATO's members appear to be crumbling from within. China sees opportunity of a different kind. Beijing has been cultivating influence in Europe through trade, investment, and diplomacy. A weakened France is easier to sway, less capable of resisting economic pressure, and less credible in defending European unity. Chinese analysts will argue that Europe cannot be a pole in a multipolar world if its second-largest economy is unstable, and they will push the global south to draw a contrast: China's stability versus Europe's chaos. The hook here is clear. In the global contest of systems, French instability tilts perception in China's favor. BRICS, too, gains momentum from this crisis. As France struggles, the narrative of a global South rising gathers strength. Nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia look at Paris with skepticism. They ask themselves why they should follow a Europe that cannot govern itself when BRICS nations present an image of resilience and growth. In Africa especially, where France has tried to preserve influence, instability at home undermines credibility abroad. Leaders in the Sahel or Central Africa can now point to Paris and say, why should we trust a partner that cannot even stabilize its own government? The hook here is undeniable. Domestic weakness in France accelerates the shift toward multipolarity. We must also consider the psychological effect on alliances. Trust is the currency of coalitions. Allies do not only count tanks and euros, they count on stability and predictability. France's revolving door of prime ministers erodes that trust. Even when Macron insists that France is committed, his words ring hollow if allies believe the next collapse is only months away. Trust, once lost, is slow to rebuild. And in alliances, perception is often more decisive than capability. Finally, the broader trend becomes impossible to ignore. We are living in an era where domestic crises no longer remain domestic. The debt ceilings in Washington, the farmers' protests in India, the government collapses in Paris, all of these events ricochet across borders, shaping the strategic balance. The collapse of the French government is part of a larger pattern: the erosion of Western cohesion and the rise of multipolar uncertainty. This is not just France's problem. It is Europe's problem, NATO's problem, and ultimately the West's problem. The hook is clear. Domestic politics has become global politics. France's internal collapse reshapes alliances, empowers adversaries, weakens cohesion, and accelerates the march toward a fragmented multipolar order. In the halls of Brussels, in the corridors of NATO, in the offices of Moscow and Beijing, the message is received the same way: a France that cannot govern itself, cannot lead others. As we close this analysis, let us return to the fundamental reality. The collapse of France's government is not just another episode in the long tradition of French political turbulence. It is a rupture that reveals the fragility of one of Europe's core powers. Today we are witnessing not a passing crisis, but the convergence of economic strain, political paralysis, and social anger into a systemic failure with consequences that extend far beyond France's borders. Think about the sequence. François Bayrou rose with promises of fiscal responsibility, only to be crushed by a no-confidence vote. Emmanuel Macron turned to Sébastien Lecornu, his fourth prime minister in 2 years, hoping to restore order. Yet, each replacement has made the cycle look less like renewal and more like desperation. The revolving door is not stabilizing France, it is exposing the emptiness of authority. The hook is clear. When leadership changes faster than trust can be rebuilt, legitimacy evaporates. For ordinary French citizens, this collapse is not theory. It is lived reality. They see austerity in their paychecks, instability in their workplaces, and uncertainty in their futures. For investors, it is a warning flare. If France begins to resemble Italy in its debt profile, the Eurozone may face its next great test. For allies, it is a crisis of confidence. Can Europe's second-largest economy be counted on when its politics are in freefall? For adversaries, it is confirmation that the Western project is weakening from within. The imagery is unavoidable. France, long a pillar of Europe, now looks like a house of cards trembling on the edge of collapse. Each protest, each failed reform, each resignation pulls another card from the structure. At some point, the entire architecture may fall not just in Paris, but across Europe. Picture the domino effect: instability in France, weakening the EU, weakening NATO, weakening the credibility of the West itself. And here is the haunting question. If France, the heart of Europe, cannot govern itself, who will lead Europe forward? Will Germany stand alone, risking resentment and overextension? Will Brussels lose the ability to coordinate it all? Or will rival powers outside Europe seize the chance to shape the global order while the West falters? This is not just about France's debt, or its protests, or its prime ministers. It is about the illusion that domestic politics and global stability are separate spheres. That illusion has now shattered. Domestic weakness has become geopolitical vulnerability, and the collapse of France's government is proof. The hook is undeniable. This is not the end of a domestic crisis. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that Europe's core is unshakable, that Western democracies can endlessly absorb turmoil, that perception of strength can substitute for reality. Today, that illusion lies in ruins in Paris, and the world is watching, with consequences that will reverberate far beyond France for years to come.